There is a rock formation in northern Ontario, Canada, that most people have never heard of and will never visit. It sits in the Canadian Shield, that ancient, scarred expanse of exposed Precambrian bedrock that forms the geological backbone of the continent. Tourists drive past it on the Trans-Canada Highway. Fishermen walk over it to reach remote lakes. Geologists stop, take samples, swear under their breath. To the untrained eye, the rock is unremarkable. Banded, layered, reddish in some places, grey in others. The kind of thing you might step across without a second thought, assuming it was just another piece of old Canadian wilderness. But if you knew what you were looking at, you would stop. You would crouch down. You would press your palm against its cold, striated surface. And you would understand that you were touching one of the most important chapters in the history of life on Earth. A chapter most people have never heard of. A catastrophe that dwarfs everything that came after it. Not an asteroid. Not a supervolcano. Not any of the forces we usually associate with mass death. But by breathing. The rock you are touching is part of what geologists call the Huronian supergroup. It was laid down between 2.4 and 2.1 billion years ago, during and after the most transformative event in Earth's atmospheric history. And embedded within its layers is the evidence of a catastrophe so total, so global, so permanent in its consequences that no subsequent extinction event, not the one that killed the trilobites, not the one that killed the dinosaurs, not any of the 5 mass extinctions we usually talk about, comes close. During this event, somewhere between 90 and 99% of all life on Earth was killed. Not 96% of marine species, like the Great Dying. Not 75% of all species, like the asteroid. We are talking about the near-total elimination of all life everywhere on the planet. Ocean, seafloor, continental margins, every last habitat that existed in a world that had not yet produced a single complex organism, killed by a gas that is, at this very moment, keeping you alive. This is the story of the Great Oxidation Event, and it is the most important story about life on Earth that almost nobody knows. Before you settle in, if these kinds of journeys through deep time are what you come here for, consider subscribing and leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from tonight. It genuinely moves me every time I see how far these stories travel. Now let the modern world go. Let the room get quiet. Turn off your notifications if you can. Come with me back to a world so ancient, so alien, that nothing alive today would recognize it. We are going to need to take our time. 2 billion years is not a distance the human mind was built to travel. So let us go slowly. Let us go carefully. Let us go together. Part 1. The Orange Sky. To understand what happened 2.4 billion years ago, you first have to understand what the world looked like before it happened. And that world will require you to set aside almost every assumption you carry about what a planet looks like when it is alive. There were no animals, no plants, no fungi, no insects, no fish, no worms, no forests, no grasslands, no reefs. There was no soil in any meaningful sense. The continents, such as they were bare rock, scoured and silent, under a sky that was not blue. The sky in the Archean eon was orange, not a gentle sunset orange, a deep, chemical, rusty amber, or a dim brownish haze, depending on the hour and the latitude. The atmosphere was dominated by nitrogen, carbon dioxide, and methane. The same methane that today contributes to climate warming, but back then it was the planet's primary thermostat. Let me pause on that for a moment. Methane. We think of it today as a pollutant, a byproduct of cows and landfills and melting permafrost. But in the Archean, methane was the difference between a living world and a frozen tomb. Here's the thing. The sun, 2.4 billion years ago, was roughly 20% dimmer than it is today. Without a thick blanket of methane-trapping heat, Earth would have been a frozen snowball. The methane wasn't just present. It was necessary. Without it, no liquid water. Without liquid water, no life. So the sky was orange because of that methane. Not blue like ours. Not the pale blue of a winter afternoon. Orange. A color most humans have never seen in the sky above them unless they were standing in the path of a wildfire or a desert dust storm. The oceans existed, and they were full of life. But not life you would recognize. The seas of the Archean were green, or greenish, stained by dissolved iron compounds that had been leaching from the seafloor and continental margins for billions of years. Imagine standing on a shore of black volcanic sand, looking out at an ocean that looks more like diluted chlorophyll than anything you have ever sailed on. That green, that thick, that alien. The water was warm. Probably warmer than modern tropical oceans in many places, fed by a planet that still radiated significant internal heat from its formation and from radioactive decay. The tides moved differently because the moon was closer. The days were shorter because Earth spun faster. A day in the Archean was perhaps 18 hours long. A year was longer because the planet's orbit was slightly different. Everything was different, and yet life was already there. And in that warm, green, iron-rich water, in communities so dense they formed visible mats on the seafloor, lived the only inhabitants Earth had ever known. Bacteria, not one kind. The bacterial world of the Archean was genuinely diverse. There were bacteria that fed on sulfur compounds from hydrothermal vents, bacteria that consumed iron directly, using it like we use oxygen, bacteria that lived on chemical energy extracted from rock, a process called chemosynthesis that still exists today in the dark corners of the deep ocean. Bacteria that ate other bacteria because predation is older than eyes or bones or nervous systems, and methanogens, methane producers, that were effectively responsible for keeping the planet warm enough to sustain any life at all. These were not plants. They were not animals. They were archaea, a whole separate domain of life that most people have never heard of. They took hydrogen and carbon dioxide and produced methane as waste. And that methane, molecule by molecule, breath by breath, kept the world from freezing. Every single one of them shared one fundamental characteristic. None of them used oxygen. None of them needed oxygen. And for almost all of them, oxygen was lethal. Let me say that again in a different way. For the first 2 billion years of Earth's existence, the dominant, successful, planet-spanning forms of life were organisms that would die if exposed to the gas you are breathing right now. This is the key fact that unlocks everything that follows. Life on Earth for its first 2 billion years had evolved in a world with no free oxygen in the atmosphere or oceans. Oxygen is chemically aggressive. It oxidizes metals. It turns iron to rust. It turns butter rancid. It breaks down organic compounds. It disrupts the delicate chemistry of cells that evolved in its complete absence. To the organisms of the Archean, oxygen was not life-giving. It was a corrosive poison, as lethal as chlorine gas is to us, as lethal as cyanide. You could not have shown them a candle flame or a burning log because combustion requires oxygen. Fire did not yet exist on Earth. There was no combustion. There was no rust. There was no ozone layer. There was no blue sky. The world was alive. The world was completely anaerobic. And nothing in 2 billion years of evolution had suggested this would ever change. And then, somewhere in the warm, shallow seas, something did change. Part 2. The first breath. The cyanobacteria did not arrive suddenly. Evolution doesn't work that way. They emerged gradually from ancestral bacterial lineages somewhere between 3.5 and 2.7 billion years ago. The precise timing still debated, the evidence fragmentary and so old that reading it requires more interpretive care than almost anything else in the geological record. Let me tell you about that evidence. It comes from places like Western Australia, where rocks called the Strelley Pool Formation contain microscopic structures that some paleontologists interpret as fossilized cyanobacteria. It comes from the Belingwe Greenstone Belt in Zimbabwe. It comes from the Pilbara Craton, a chunk of ancient crust that has been sitting there, more or less undisturbed, since before most of the continents even existed. These are not fossils in the way you are thinking. Not bones. Not shells. Not petrified wood. These are stromatolites, layered mounds built by microbial communities, each layer a generation of bacteria that trapped sediment as they grew. Imagine a reef, but instead of coral, it is made of slime and sand, built millimeter by millimeter over tens of thousands of years. You can still find living stromatolites today in a few places on Earth. Shark Bay in Western Australia, some lakes in Mexico, a few other remote locations. They are living fossils. They are windows into a world that no longer exists. And if you ever get to touch one, you are touching a structure that has been building itself in exactly the same way for over 3 billion years. But the cyanobacteria arrived, and they brought something the world had never seen: oxygenic photosynthesis. Here's the chemistry, and it's worth understanding because it's both simple and extraordinary. All photosynthesis captures sunlight to build organic molecules. Bacteria had been doing versions of this for billions of years. But the older forms used hydrogen sulfide or other compounds as raw material, and they produced sulfur or other byproducts as waste. Cyanobacteria did something different. They learned to split water. Water, the most abundant liquid on the planet's surface, the universal solvent, the compound every organism depended on. The cyanobacteria figured out how to tear water molecules apart, capture the hydrogen for their own biochemistry, and discard the oxygen as a waste product. The oxygen was the exhaust of their metabolism, the thing they threw away, the unwanted byproduct of a process designed entirely to produce energy. They didn't release oxygen because it was useful. They released it because they had no use for it, and it had to go somewhere. Think about that. One of the most consequential innovations in the history of life was not an adaptation to anything. It was not a response to environmental pressure in any straightforward sense. It was a metabolic hack, a way to get more energy from sunlight by using a more abundant raw material. Water was everywhere. Hydrogen sulfide was not. So the lineage that figured out how to split water had access to an essentially unlimited fuel source. They exploded. Not literally, but in evolutionary terms. Cyanobacteria spread across the shallow seas of the Archean with a speed that, for bacteria, was breathtaking. They formed enormous mats that covered the seafloor for thousands of square kilometers. They turned the green oceans even greener. They changed the color of the planet from space if there had been anyone in space to see it. And they began pumping out oxygen. For a long time, it went nowhere dangerous. The early oceans were full of dissolved iron. Every molecule of oxygen the cyanobacteria released immediately reacted with that iron, forming iron oxide, rust, and sinking to the seafloor as reddish sediment. This is where banded iron formations come from, those spectacular striped rock formations mined today for steel on every continent. They are the fossilized exhaust of cyanobacteria. Each red band is a layer of rust. Each rust layer is a record of oxygen being produced and immediately consumed. Let me describe a banded iron formation for you. Imagine a cliff face, hundreds of feet high, striped like a giant piece of bacon. Red layers alternating with dark grey or black layers. The red is hematite, iron oxide. The dark is chert, a form of silica. Each pair of layers represents a cycle of oxygen production and sedimentation, perhaps seasonal, perhaps linked to changes in ocean chemistry that we still do not fully understand. The largest banded iron formations on Earth are in Western Australia, South Africa, Brazil, Minnesota, and Michigan. They are the source of most of the iron that built the industrial world. Every skyscraper, every car, every bridge, every railroad track made of steel contains iron that was originally precipitated from ancient seawater by the oxygen waste of cyanobacteria. You are living in a world built from their exhaust. For hundreds of millions of years, this balance held. Cyanobacteria produced oxygen. Iron soaked it up. The atmosphere remained anaerobic. Life continued as it always had in its ancient bacterial way, unaware that something was accumulating in the chemistry of the world that would eventually make the old way of life impossible. But the iron was not infinite. The iron in the oceans came from two sources. Hydrothermal vents on the seafloor, which pumped iron-rich fluids into the deep ocean, and the weathering of continental rocks, which washed iron into the seas. Both processes were slow. Both had been running for billions of years. But the cyanobacteria were consuming iron faster than it was being supplied. The iron ran out. Not all at once. Not in a single moment. But gradually, over millions of years, the dissolved iron in the oceans was exhausted. The cyanobacteria had been rusting it out of the water for so long that there was nothing left to absorb the oxygen they kept producing. When the iron sink failed, the oxygen had nowhere to go but up. It began to accumulate in the water. Then it began to reach the atmosphere. What happened next is what geologists call the Great Oxidation Event. What it actually was, experienced from inside the world it destroyed, was the end of everything. Part 3. The poison. To the anaerobic organisms that had dominated Earth for 2 billion years, rising oxygen was not a gradual inconvenience. It was a chemical apocalypse. Let me try to help you feel this. Imagine that over the course of a few decades, the air around you slowly changed. Not in a way you could smell or see, but one day you notice that your skin is tingling. Then your eyes start to water. Then you feel a burning in your lungs. Then the plants around you begin to wilt and die. Then the insects disappear. Then the birds fall from the sky. Now imagine that the cause of all this is a gas that you cannot avoid, that fills every room, that seeps through every crack, that is being pumped out by something that was once harmless but has now overwhelmed the planet's ability to absorb it. That is what the Great Oxidation Event felt like to the anaerobes, except they had no lungs to burn, they had no eyes to water. They were single cells, and the damage was happening at the molecular level. Think about what oxygen does to an unprotected cell. Oxygen is a strong oxidizing agent. It strips electrons from other molecules with an aggression that, to an organism evolved in its complete absence, is catastrophic. It damages proteins. It destroys DNA. It disrupts cell membranes. It interferes with the very enzymes anaerobes use to generate energy. It doesn't just slow them down, it kills them. There was no warning, no possibility of behavioral adaptation. An anaerobic bacterium cannot choose to move somewhere with less oxygen when oxygen is filling the entire ocean and flooding into the atmosphere simultaneously. The only escape was downward, into deepest sediments, into hydrothermal vent systems, into airless spaces deep inside rocks, into the few remaining environments where oxygen could not penetrate. Those that could reach such refuges survived. Everything else died. The scale of death is almost impossible to quantify precisely. Microbial fossils from this era are extraordinarily rare, but the best estimates, based on the geological record and on biogeochemical models, suggest the Great Oxidation Event eliminated somewhere between 90 and 99% of all life on Earth. Let me put that number in perspective. If the human population of Earth were reduced by 99%, that would mean fewer than 80 million people left alive. That is about the population of Germany. Everyone else gone. Every city empty. Every farm abandoned. Every road silent. But it was worse than that, because the anaerobes had no agriculture, no medicine, no technology. They had only their biochemistry, and their biochemistry was failing. Every species of anaerobe that could not find a refuge. Every bacterium that could not rapidly evolve protection. Every microbe that had spent billions of years perfectly adapted to an oxygen-free world. Gone. Extinct. Wiped from the tree of life. Some of those anaerobic lineages still exist today, by the way. They are the ones that found refuges. You can find them in the mud at the bottom of a swamp, in the guts of termites, in hydrothermal vents deep in the Pacific, in the anaerobic digesters that treat sewage. They are the survivors. They are the descendants of the ones that hid and waited and endured. But most of their relatives died. This was not a mass extinction in the way we usually use that phrase. The 5 mass extinctions we talk about: End Ordovician, Late Devonian, End Permian, End Triassic, End Cretaceous. All involved complex multicellular organisms dying over tens of thousands to millions of years. The Great Oxidation Event was different. The victims were microbes. The timeline was compressed in geological terms, but stretched across hundreds of thousands of years of silent, invisible death, and the percentage of life eliminated was higher than any subsequent event has managed. The world's first mass extinction was caused by breathing, but the death of the anaerobes was only the beginning. Part 4. The Long Freeze. Because the cyanobacteria had not only poisoned the ocean, they had also, without any intention or awareness, begun to destroy the planetary climate system that kept Earth warm enough to support life at all. Remember the methane. The Archean atmosphere was rich in methane produced by the methanogens. Methane is a far more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. Molecule for molecule, it traps roughly 80 times more heat than CO2 over a 20-year period. In the Archean, with a sun 20% dimmer, that methane greenhouse wasn't just useful. It was essential. Without it, the planet's surface would have dropped far below freezing. The oceans would have frozen solid. Now here is the chemical fact that changed everything. When the Great Oxidation Event poured free oxygen into the atmosphere, something chemically inevitable happened. Oxygen and methane react. They destroy each other. Oxygen tears methane apart, converting it into carbon dioxide and water, both far less effective greenhouse gases. This is not a slow reaction at room temperature. It is fast. In the presence of sunlight, oxygen and methane react readily. And as oxygen levels rose, the methane levels began to fall. As cyanobacteria filled the atmosphere with oxygen, the oxygen destroyed the methane. As methane was destroyed, the greenhouse effect weakened. As the greenhouse weakened, the planet began to cool. The cooling was not gradual. When the methane greenhouse collapsed, Global temperatures plunged. Ice began forming at the poles. And because ice reflects sunlight rather than absorbing it, a property called albedo, the cooling accelerated. More ice reflected, more sunlight. More reflection caused more cooling. More cooling caused more ice. This positive feedback loop, the same one climate scientists worry about today in a warming world, but operating in reverse, did not stop until the ice had spread across the entire planet. What followed was the Huronian glaciation, the oldest ice age in Earth's history. A global freeze that lasted, depending on which geological evidence you consult, somewhere between 200 and 300 million years. 300 million years of ice. Let me help you feel that number. 300 million years ago, the continents were arranged differently. The supercontinent Pangaea was just beginning to form. The first dinosaurs would not appear for another 70 million years. The first mammals would not appear for another 150 million years. 300 million years from now, if humanity survives that long, our descendants might be unrecognizable, living on a planet we cannot imagine. Now multiply that feeling by 3. The Huronian glaciation lasted 3 times longer than the entire existence of the dinosaurs. Average global temperature during the Huronian, roughly minus 40 degrees Celsius. Colder than modern Antarctica in winter. Cold enough that the oceans were frozen to significant depth. Cold enough that liquid water existed at the surface only near hydrothermal vents and in isolated pockets of geothermal heat. Cold enough that the planet was, for all practical purposes, a white ball in space, gleaming with reflected sunlight. For 300 million years, this was the world. An ice-covered planet. Life compressed into the smallest, darkest refuges imaginable. The rich bacterial communities that had once carpeted shallow ocean floors. The methanogens that had warmed the atmosphere. The diverse biosphere that had taken 2 billion years to build. All of it reduced to scattered survivors in the dark. It is worth pausing here. From the moment you are listening to these words, going back 300 million years takes you to before the first dinosaurs, before the Permian, before the Carboniferous forests, before the first land plants, before the first fish with jaws. The Huronian glaciation lasted longer than all of that combined. And through all of it, in the darkness under the ice, life persisted. Let me describe those refuges. Deep-sea hydrothermal vents, where magma heats water to hundreds of degrees and chemical energy replaces sunlight. Subsurface aquifers, deep inside the crust, where water flows through cracks in rock and microbes live on hydrogen and carbon dioxide. The bottoms of the deepest ocean trenches, where the pressure is crushing and the water stays liquid because of that pressure. Sediments buried under kilometers of ice, insulated from the surface cold. These refuges still exist today. They are the places where the anaerobic world lingers. They are the places where life continues to live the old way, without oxygen, without photosynthesis, without the sun. And they are the places where the survivors of the Great Oxidation Event waited out the longest winter in Earth's history. Part 5. The thaw. How did the planet escape? The same way a snowball Earth always ends. Volcanism. Even under kilometers of ice, plate tectonics continued. The mantle kept convecting. The crust kept moving. Volcanoes kept erupting, punching through the ice sheet, pouring lava onto the frozen surface and releasing gases into the atmosphere. And volcanoes produce carbon dioxide. For 300 million years, while the surface of the planet was locked under ice and almost nothing lived on it, volcanoes quietly pumped CO2 into the atmosphere. The ice prevented rainfall. This is crucial. Rainfall is the main mechanism by which CO2 is removed from the atmosphere over geological timescales. Rain combines with CO2 to form carbonic acid, which weathers rocks, which locks the carbon into carbonate minerals, which eventually end up on the seafloor. No rain, no weathering. No weathering, no CO2 removal. So the CO2 simply accumulated, year after year, century after century, millennium after millennium, for 300 million years. Slowly at first, because the ice was still reflecting most of the sunlight. Then faster as concentrations climbed. Then faster still as the warming began to melt the margins of the ice, exposing dark ocean and rock that absorbed sunlight instead of reflecting it. The same feedback that had driven the freeze now operated in reverse, driving the thaw with increasing speed. This is the terrifying beauty of planetary feedback loops. They can push a world in either direction. A little ice leads to more ice leads to a frozen planet. A little warming leads to more warming leads to a greenhouse world. The same physics, the same chemistry, just running in opposite directions. When the Huronian glaciation finally ended, roughly 2.1 billion years ago, the world that emerged was profoundly and permanently different. The atmosphere now contained free oxygen. Not the 21% that we breathe today, but a permanent, measurable, growing presence of oxygen in the air and dissolved in the upper ocean. Estimates vary, but most models suggest oxygen levels rose from effectively zero to somewhere between 1 and 10% of modern levels during the first Great Oxygenation. Enough to poison anaerobes. Enough to change the chemistry of the planet forever. The ozone layer was beginning to form in the upper atmosphere. That thin shield of O3 molecules that absorbs most of the sun's ultraviolet radiation. Before the ozone layer, the surface of the planet was bathed in UV levels that would give a human a fatal sunburn in minutes. With the ozone layer beginning to build, the surface was becoming, for the first time in Earth's history, a place where life might eventually be possible on land. Not yet. Not for hundreds of millions more years. But the door was opening. The iron-rich green oceans of the Archean were being replaced by clearer waters. The dissolved iron that had once turned the seas the color of diluted chlorophyll was now rusted out, precipitated onto the seafloor in the banded iron formations we talked about earlier. The water became blue. Not the deep blue of the modern open ocean, but something closer to it. The first blue skies. The first blue seas. The world was becoming, slowly, recognizably, more like the world we know. And the survivors of the catastrophe were inheriting a world that their ancestors had never known, and that they had created entirely by accident. Part 6. The near suicide of a lineage. Here is the part of this story I find most quietly astonishing. The cyanobacteria nearly killed themselves. Think about what they had done. They evolved a metabolism that produced oxygen as waste. Oxygen was toxic to almost everything on Earth, including, in high enough concentrations, the cyanobacteria themselves. The oxygen they produced destroyed the methane greenhouse and froze the planet, threatening every habitat where they could survive. The very act of their success, the rapid proliferation of cyanobacterial communities across the ancient ocean, had made the catastrophe possible. They were the agents of their own near extinction, and yet they survived. Some by finding low oxygen refuges at depth in the same dark places where the anaerobes hid. Some by evolving mechanisms to tolerate or even use oxygen in their metabolism, producing antioxidant enzymes that neutralize the reactive oxygen species damaging their cells. Some simply by persisting in dormant states through the long freeze, waiting for conditions to change in a way they had no capacity to anticipate or understand. And when the thaw came, the cyanobacteria were still there, ready to begin again, ready to keep producing oxygen, ready to keep filling the atmosphere, ready to keep building the world that would eventually, hundreds of millions of years later, make complex life possible. There is something in this that resists easy framing as either triumph or tragedy. The cyanobacteria did not choose to poison the world. They did not choose to freeze it. They simply did what their biochemistry made them do, and the consequences cascaded outward through the chemistry of the atmosphere and the ocean in ways that no individual organism experienced or could have experienced as a connected chain of cause and effect. They were the most consequential organisms in the history of life on Earth, and they had no idea. Let me stay with this for a moment, because I think it matters. We are accustomed to stories of heroes and villains, of intention and consequence. The cyanobacteria are neither. They are not heroes because they made complex life possible. They are not villains because they killed most of the life that existed before them. They are simply a lineage that stumbled upon a new way to get energy, and that new way changed the world. You could tell the same story about plants, by the way. When plants colonized land, they changed the atmosphere, weathered rocks into soil, altered the global carbon cycle, and helped trigger the Carboniferous Ice Age. They did not mean to. They were just growing. When algae started producing dimethyl sulfide, they changed cloud formation over the oceans. When trees evolved lignin, they changed the carbon cycle so profoundly that it took fungi tens of millions of years to evolve the ability to break it down. Life changes the planet. It cannot help it. Every metabolic pathway, every new adaptation, every evolutionary innovation ripples outward through the chemistry of the atmosphere, the oceans, the rocks. The planet and its life are not separate things. They are a single, coupled system. Change one and you change the other. The cyanobacteria were the first to discover this on a global scale. They were not the last. Part 7. The delay. The question that scientists have been asking for decades, with growing precision and increasingly sophisticated tools, is not whether the Great Oxidation Event happened. The geological evidence for that is overwhelming and unambiguous. The question is why it took so long. Cyanobacteria evolved somewhere between 3.5 and 2.7 billion years ago. The Great Oxidation Event began 2.4 billion years ago. That gap, depending on which estimates you use, is somewhere between 300 million and a billion years during which cyanobacteria were producing oxygen, but the oxygen was not accumulating in the atmosphere. Why the delay? For much of the last century, the answer seemed obvious: the iron sink. The dissolved iron in the oceans was absorbing the oxygen as fast as the cyanobacteria produced it. And that is part of the answer. But a 2025 paper published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society by researchers from the University of Victoria and Penn State added another layer to the explanation that significantly complicates the picture. The researchers built detailed biogeochemical models of the early Earth's atmosphere and found that even with abundant cyanobacteria producing oxygen, multiple factors worked together to suppress atmospheric oxygen accumulation. Rapid oxidation reactions in an atmosphere without an ozone layer destroyed oxygen molecules before they could accumulate. Nutrient limitations, particularly phosphorus and nitrogen, constrained how fast cyanobacteria could grow. The methane-rich atmosphere actively competed with oxygen chemically, reacting with it to form carbon dioxide and water. The delay was not a single bottleneck. It was a whole system of interconnected suppression mechanisms, each one contributing to holding the oxygen level below the threshold at which it could begin accumulating in a self-sustaining way. For hundreds of millions of years, the cyanobacteria produced oxygen and the planet consumed it almost as fast as it was made. Let me give you a metaphor. Imagine a bathtub with the drain open. You turn on the faucet. Water flows in. But if the drain is big enough, the water level never rises. The Great Oxidation Event is the moment when the flow from the faucet finally exceeds the capacity of the drain, and then the water level begins to climb. Fast. What caused that tipping point? The exact mechanism is still actively debated. Perhaps cyanobacterial populations crossed a size threshold after evolving some new adaptation. Better nutrient uptake, more efficient photosynthesis, resistance to oxygen toxicity. Perhaps nutrient availability changed because of shifts in volcanic activity or continental weathering. Perhaps the volcanic activity of the Archean declined enough to reduce competing chemical sinks. Perhaps all of these factors shifted simultaneously in the same direction over millions of years. Whatever tipped it, the system crossed a threshold and the oxygen began to accumulate. And once it began to accumulate, it accelerated. Because oxygen itself suppressed the methane that had been helping to consume it. The more oxygen there was, the less methane there was to react with it. So the oxygen rose faster. A positive feedback loop in the other direction now, pushing the transition toward an oxygenated world with increasing speed. The scientists who study this event use the phrase oxygen overshoot to describe what happened next. There is evidence from the rock record that atmospheric oxygen did not simply rise to some stable level and stay there. It rose rapidly, then fell back as the methane greenhouse collapsed and the Huronian glaciation suppressed biological productivity. Then it rose again as the planet thawed. Then it fell again. The transition was not a smooth curve, but a series of lurches and crashes, the atmosphere oscillating between different chemical states as the system searched for a new equilibrium. A 2024 study in Geophysical Research Letters used photochemical models to show that the global glaciations of the Huronian period themselves could have driven oscillations in oxygen levels. The freeze and thaw cycles altered biological productivity and chemical weathering rates in ways that pushed oxygen up and down repeatedly before it finally stabilized. The Great Oxidation Event was not a single moment. It was a 300 million year crisis, a planetary system lurching between different chemical states, life being destroyed and compressed, and slowly rebuilding in a world whose chemistry was changing faster than any previous evolutionary experience had prepared it for. Part 8, The Quiet Survivors. There is a researcher at Syracuse University whose work I want to mention because it represents the kind of patient, painstaking science that gradually illuminates events this ancient and this poorly preserved. In 2025, a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences analyzed nitrogen isotopes from ancient South African rock cores representing seafloor sediments laid down before, during, and after the Great Oxidation Event.
Nitrogen isotopes in marine sediments carry a chemical signature of the biological and chemical processes occurring in the ocean at the time of deposition.
By reading those signatures across the boundary of the oxygenation event, the researchers found evidence that aerobic nitrogen cycling, the biological processing of nitrogen compounds using oxygen, had begun approximately 100 million years before oxygen started visibly accumulating in the atmosphere. This finding matters because it pushes back the evidence for oxygen's influence on ocean chemistry by 100 million years. It suggests that the transition was even longer and more complex than the atmospheric record alone indicates. Oxygen was already reshaping the chemistry of the ancient ocean well before it accumulated in the air above it. The Great Oxidation Event was not the moment oxygen arrived. It was the moment oxygen finally won a planetary war that had been fought in slow motion for hundreds of millions of years. The rock records this. The nitrogen isotopes record this. The banded iron formations record this. The oldest glacial deposits on Earth, diamectites from the Huronian supergroup itself, record this. The evidence is distributed across dozens of countries, hundreds of field sites, decades of careful analysis. And still, the picture is incomplete. Still, we are working out the precise sequence of events. Still, we are calibrating the models, questioning the dates, arguing about the mechanisms. The Great Oxidation Event happened 2.4 billion years ago. We have been studying it systematically for perhaps 50 years. We have not figured it out yet. We have figured out enough to tell its story. But the full truth of what happened in those 300 million years of chemical revolution is still being assembled from rocks that are almost as old as complex life itself. Let me take you to one of those rock formations. The Huronian supergroup in Ontario is not a single cliff or canyon. It is a sequence of sedimentary and volcanic rocks that outcrops across a vast area north of Lake Huron. Some of its members are glacial deposits, tillites, dropstones, striated pavements, that provide the evidence for the Huronian glaciation. Others are marine shales and sandstones that preserve the chemical signature of the oceans before, during, and after the oxygenation event. One formation within the Huronian is called the McKim Formation. It contains some of the oldest glacial deposits on Earth. Another is the Gauganda Formation, which has beautiful dropstones, pebbles and boulders that fell from melting ice rafts into fine-grained sediment, bending the layers beneath them. You can see those dropstones with your own eyes if you know where to look. They are the smoking gun of the oldest ice age. And elsewhere in the Huronian, you find the banded iron formations, the rust, the fossilized exhaust, layer after layer of red and black, recording the oxygen that the cyanobacteria produced and the iron that consumed it, cycle after cycle, for millions of years. The rock is patient. It has been waiting 2.4 billion years for someone to come along and learn to read it. That reading is still in progress, still incomplete, still yielding surprises to anyone patient enough to look. Part 9, The Legacy in Your Blood. I want to bring this back to something concrete and present. Because the story of the Great Oxidation Event is not only ancient history, it is, in a very direct sense, the story of the air you are breathing right now. Every breath you draw contains approximately 21% oxygen. That oxygen did not exist in Earth's atmosphere for the first 2 billion years of the planet's history. It is the product of photosynthesis. It is the accumulated waste of billions of years of plant and algal and cyanobacterial metabolism, producing oxygen they did not need and releasing it into the world. The oxygen in this room, in your lungs, in your blood, is the legacy of the cyanobacteria and the catastrophe they caused. It is the legacy of the Great Oxidation Event and the mass extinction and the 300 million year ice age that followed. It is the legacy of the organisms that survived by hiding in the dark and cold and then emerging when the world changed again to inherit a planet transformed by their absent competitors. When you breathe in tonight, you are breathing the aftermath of Earth's first apocalypse. The aftermath that made you possible. Your mitochondria. Those small organelles in every cell of your body that convert oxygen and sugar into the energy that keeps your neurons firing and your heart beating, are the direct descendants of aerobic bacteria that thrived in the oxygen-rich world that emerged from the catastrophe. They were free-living bacteria once, swimming in the Proterozoic oceans. Then, somewhere around 1.5 to 2 billion years ago, one of them was engulfed by a larger cell and not digested. Instead, they formed a partnership. The larger cell provided protection and food. The smaller cell provided energy, far more efficiently than the larger cell could produce on its own.
That partnership became the foundation of all complex life. Every eukaryote, every organism with a cell nucleus, which includes all animals, all plants, all fungi, all algae, every visible living thing that is not a bacterium or an archaeon, traces its lineage back to that merger. Your mitochondria have their own DNA, separate from the DNA in your nucleus. That DNA is the remnant of the genome of an aerobic bacterium that survived the Great Oxidation Event. You contain within you the survivors of the world's first mass extinction. Their chemistry is your chemistry. Their inheritance is your breath. Let me say that again. The mitochondria in your cells are not human. They are bacterial. They reproduce independently inside your cells. They have their own ribosomes, their own membranes, their own genetic code. They are the descendants of organisms that lived through the oxygen catastrophe, that adapted to the poison, that learned to use it for energy, and that eventually took up.
Residents inside the cells of our distant ancestors. You are a walking community of ancient survivors. Your body hosts trillions of bacteria, most of them beneficial, some of them essential. Your mitochondria are the most essential of all. Without them, you could not extract energy from food. Without them, you could not think, or move, or keep your body warm. Without them, you would die in seconds. And they exist because of the Great Oxidation Event. Because the world was poisoned, and then frozen, and then thawed. Because the cyanobacteria changed everything. Because the survivors found a way. Part 10. Could it happen again? There is a question that scientists have begun to ask about the Great Oxidation Event that I want to raise here, not because it has been answered, but because it sits at the edge of what we understand and is worth carrying. Could it happen again? Not in the same way. The atmosphere is already oxygenated. The feedbacks that drove the original event have long since completed their work. There is no vast reservoir of unoxidized iron in the oceans waiting to absorb a new poison. The methane greenhouse is gone, replaced by a different greenhouse chemistry. The Great Oxidation Event is a unique chapter in Earth's history. It cannot be repeated. But the deeper question, whether a biological innovation can accidentally and catastrophically transform the chemistry of the planet on which it evolved, whether life can poison its own world without knowing it, whether a lineage can thrive so successfully that it destabilizes the conditions that made its own survival possible. That question remains alive in ways that are not merely historical. We are not cyanobacteria. We are conscious. We can understand what we are doing. We can model the consequences of our chemistry on the atmosphere. We have the capacity, unique in the history of life, to foresee catastrophe and choose a different path. Whether we use that capacity is a different question, one that belongs to a different kind of documentary than this one. For tonight, it is enough to know what happened 2.4 billion years ago. To know that the planet you are lying on was once covered in ice because tiny organisms produced too much of something their world could not absorb. To know that almost everything alive at that time died. To know that from the survivors, slowly and over incomprehensible spans of time, came the complexity that eventually produced you. The cyanobacteria are still here, by the way. They are still in every sunlit body of water on Earth, still producing oxygen, still doing exactly what they have done for at least 2.7 billion years. If you have ever seen a blue-green algal bloom on a lake or a pond, that is them. The most consequential organisms in the history of life on Earth, still going about their business, still producing the gas that makes complex life possible, still completely unaware of what they once did to the world. They will likely outlast us by a considerable margin. Part 11. The deep time perspective. Let me step back even further. Because the Great Oxidation Event is not just a story about cyanobacteria and anaerobes and ice. It is a story about deep time itself, about the scales that the human mind was not built to comprehend. 2.5 billion years. That number is almost meaningless to us. We live for 80 years if we are lucky. We remember for 100 if our culture is careful. Our recorded history goes back 5,000 or 6,000 years. Our species has existed for perhaps 300,000 years. Our genus, Homo, has existed for 2.5 million years. 2.5 billion years is 1,000 times longer than the existence of our genus. The Great Oxidation Event occurred closer in time to the present day than it did to the origin of life. Life emerged somewhere around 3.8 to 4.0 billion years ago, perhaps earlier. For nearly 1 billion years before the Great Oxidation Event, life was already ancient. The cyanobacteria themselves had been around for hundreds of millions of years before they changed the world. We are living in the middle of the story, not the beginning, not the end, somewhere in the middle. The Proterozoic eon, which followed the Huronian glaciation, lasted from 2.5 billion years ago to 541 million years ago. That is nearly 2 billion years. During that time, oxygen levels rose slowly, then rose again, then fluctuated. The first complex cells, eukaryotes, emerged. The first multicellular organisms appeared, simple things that looked like flattened discs or fronds. Sexual reproduction evolved, the first algae, the first fungi-like organisms. Then, around 541 million years ago, the Cambrian explosion. Within a span of perhaps 20 million years, most of the major animal body plans appeared in the fossil record. Eyes, shells, jaws, legs, brains. Everything that would eventually lead to fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, mammals, primates, humans. All of that, everything you have ever seen in a natural history museum, every animal you have ever loved or feared or eaten or kept as a pet, is built on the foundation laid down by the Great Oxidation Event. Without oxygen, complex multicellular life is energetically impossible. Without the cyanobacteria, there was no oxygen. Without the catastrophe that killed most of the world, there were no survivors to adapt and evolve and fill the new niches that oxygen opened up. We are not the purpose of that story. There is no purpose. We are a consequence. A late arriving, intelligent, anxious, creative, destructive consequence of a chemical accident that happened 2.5 billion years ago. There is a kind of humility in that, a kind of peace. The world does not revolve around us. It never did. It revolves around the sun, and even that is just a local arrangement. The deep story of life on Earth is a story of accidents and catastrophes and survivors and new beginnings. We are one of those new beginnings. Whether we will be a lasting one or just another temporary experiment is not yet written. Part 12. The Rock That Remembers. Somewhere in a research institution, in a climate-controlled archive room that smells of rock, dust and silica and the particular dry scent of very old stone, there are cores drilled from the Huronian supergroup of northern Ontario. Cylinders of rock, perhaps a meter long each, stored carefully in labelled boxes, representing vertical slices through 300 million years of ancient ocean sediment and glacial deposit. Researchers have spent careers analysing those cores, measuring isotope ratios and mineral compositions and sedimentary textures, reading in the stone the record of a catastrophe so ancient that the organisms it killed left no fossils visible to the naked eye. I want you to imagine one of those cores, smooth on its curved surface, rough on its ends, greyish in some bands, reddish in others. If you held it in your hands, you would feel its weight. It is dense, heavy, cold. The rock has been buried under kilometres of younger strata, then uplifted, then exposed, then drilled. It has been squeezed and heated and folded. It has been through more than you can imagine. And yet, locked inside it, preserved at the scale of individual atoms, is the record of what happened. The ratio of one isotope to another, the presence of certain elements in certain oxidation states, the texture of a sediment that fell through a water column that once held oxygen and iron and sulfur and life. The work continues. New techniques are applied to old cores, new sites are drilled, new data arrive that require adjustments to old models. The picture of the Great Oxidation Event is sharper than it was 20 years ago and will be sharper still 20 years from now. The rock is patient. It has been waiting 2.4 billion years for someone to come along and learn to read it. That reading is still in progress, still incomplete, still yielding surprises to anyone patient enough to look. Part 13, the end of the beginning. The ancient ocean is quiet now. The green iron-rich water of the Archean exists nowhere on the surface of the Earth. The orange methane sky is gone. The vast bacterial mats that carpeted the shallow seafloors of 2.5 billion years ago are gone, their descendants transformed beyond recognition by billions of years of evolution, their world chemically unrecoverable. The ice of the Huronian glaciation is gone. The refuges where the survivors waited out the freeze have long since been transformed by geological forces, subducted or eroded or buried under billions of years of subsequent history. The hydrothermal vents that kept pockets of the ocean liquid are still there. Some of them,
but the ice above them has melted and refrozen and melted again a dozen times over. What remains is the oxygen and the mitochondria and the rock cores in their archive boxes and the quiet fact that you are here, breathing the poison that killed most of the world, alive because of a catastrophe that no one witnessed and that the organisms it affected could not understand. That is what happened 2.4 billion years ago. That is what the rock in Ontario remembers. The world was poisoned by something invisible. Almost everything died. The ice came. And then, much later, from what survived, came everything, including this moment, including you, somewhere warm and dark, breathing in the aftermath of Earth's first apocalypse. Part 14, a meditation on breathing. Let me end with something simple, something you can do right now, wherever you are. Take a breath, a slow one. Feel the air move through your nose or your mouth, down your throat, into your lungs. Feel your chest rise. Feel the oxygen diffuse across the membranes of your lungs into your blood. Feel your heart pump that blood to every corner of your body. Now think about what you just did. Every molecule of oxygen you inhaled was produced by photosynthesis. Some of it may have come from a tree outside your window, some from algae in the ocean thousands of miles away, some from cyanobacteria in a pond down the street. But all of it, every single molecule, exists in the atmosphere because of a process that began 2.7 billion years ago and has never stopped. The oxygen you just breathed was once waste. It was once poison.
It was once the agent of the greatest mass extinction in Earth's history. And now it is the substance that keeps you alive. That is not irony. That is not poetry. That is biochemistry. That is history. That is the world you live in. A world built by accidents and catastrophes and survivors, layer upon layer, like the banded iron formations themselves. The next time you walk past a rock that looks unremarkable, reddish in places, grey in others, banded and layered and old, stop. Put your hand on it. If you are very lucky and very quiet, and you know what you are looking at, you might be touching a piece of the Huronian. You might be touching the record of the first apocalypse, and you might remember that you are made of survivors. Rest well.